My name is Adele Rowan, 34 years old. The morning the envelope slid across the counter, the kitchen still smelled like dinosaur pancakes and dish soap, and Hazel's purple ribbon lay coiled by the syrup like it needed a rest. 3 months had passed since my mother, Dorothy, died, and the world had split into loud rooms where I pretended to be fine and quiet rooms where the pretending fell apart. Our little colonial on Maple Street wore that grief honestly. Scuffed baseboards, a calendar tattooed with school pickups, and a fridge crowded with drawings that tried to make sense of days that didn't. Roland had started smelling like a different life, a sharper cologne, the kind that arrives a few seconds before the man does. He wore crisp suits on days with no meetings and hovered at his office door, thumb on the keypad like the oak needed guarding from me. Contracts on, he'd say. Time kills deals. He used to kiss Hazel's hair and toss a basketball with Timmy. Lately, he only counted steps. To the office, to the shower, to the car. One night, his Bluetooth chirped, and a woman's laugh wrapped around a word I couldn't catch. Another afternoon, I found a glossy brochure for a Florida beach house, a mortgage number scribbled in the margin as if he were doing math on a dream. At my mother's house after the funeral, Roland helped in a way that looked like kindness if you didn't watch his hands. Estate paperwork is a mess, he said, leafing through files with a practiced impatience. He lifted a sealed manila folder I hadn't seen, weighed it for a beat, then slid it beneath another stack. Old insurance. Nothing relevant. Grief makes you grateful for any scaffolding, even when it's fog. I let him build fog around me because standing in the open hurt worse. The library's fluorescent hum became my metronome. I stamped due dates, reshelved picture books, and answered phones with a cheerful voice that sometimes felt borrowed. Between the stacks, Hazel's purple ribbon turned into a talisman. She wore it to the funeral. She wore it the evening Roland stopped eating dinner with us and began answering calls in the garage. "Does Brave feel like your stomach is tired?" she whispered one night. "Yes," I said, because the truth can be both small and heavy. She nodded, satisfied that bravery and queasiness could share a room. The morning he served me divorce papers, Hazel pressed star shapes into pancake batter, and Timmy asked if dinosaurs were allowed in court. Roland placed a manila envelope beside the syrup. "I'm filing for divorce, Adele," he said, as if announcing rain. "I'm taking the kids." The room went still. I asked him to talk in private, not in front of them. He looked past me at the window as if my face were glass. "You're an unfit mother. I have documentation." He had built a case while I arranged hospice visits and managed bedtime stories with a voice that shook only when the lights were off. I learned the vocabulary of panic quickly. Affidavits, temporary orders, guardian ad litem. Roland hired Victor Ashford, the kind of lawyer who moves through courthouses like a tide. Controlled voice, leather briefcase, a talent for making words sound heavier when he carried them. My attorney, Janet Riverside, was steady and plain-spoken, and paid partly by a legal aid fund that emailed disclaimers about resources. "We'll fight," she said, squeezing my hand, and I believed her because there wasn't room for anything else. Belief, like grief, can be a structure you climb, even when you're not sure it will hold. For 6 weeks, Roland built an argument out of my sorrow and its echoes. A photo of me crying in a grocery aisle 2 weeks after the funeral became an exhibit about instability. A neighbor who liked to narrate other people's lives claimed she'd heard the kids crying for an hour. Unsure if I was home, certain it meant something. His business partner testified that at the Christmas party I'd been disconnected, not mentioning it was 3 days after the diagnosis. A child psychologist who had never met my children prepared an opinion about their needs. All of it fit together neatly if you ignored the facts that didn't sparkle under fluorescent cross-examination. Judge Patricia Thornwell looked at me the way a doctor looks at a chart she worries you won't follow. "Stability," she said often enough that the word became a drumbeat. Roland promised private academies, tutors, and an after-school schedule that sounded organized from far away. I had purple lunchbox notes and bedtime chapters, and the map of a day drawn around 2 small spines. "You've been emotionally compromised," Ashford told the court in a voice that made concern sound like a verdict. Janet's cross-examinations landed, nudging a witness here, unspooling a timeline there, but the damage clung like smoke. In private, Janet whispered that Roland was pushing for the children to be questioned in open court. Transparency, he called it, as if truth required an audience. I watched him across the aisle, mouthing words Hazel was supposed to remember, the shape of sentences practicing themselves on his lips. My stomach did the tired, brave thing again. "We'll ask for a gentle setup," Janet said. "Small chairs, closer to the bench." I nodded, grateful for any softness in a room built for hard edges and louder men. At home, the house became a witness. The damp towel on the banister because Timmy forgot again. The pencil Hazel used to draw us with Roland a little farther away each week. Perspective as prophecy. When I tucked her in, she touched the purple ribbon and asked, "Will the judge be kind?" I told her judges like truth the way librarians like returns. She laughed into her pillow, and for a moment the air lightened. Then the quiet came back and sat with me on the hallway floor until the furnace clicked on and reminded the house to keep breathing. Roland perfected a casual cruelty that sounded like advice. "Dorothy babied you," he said over coffee, not meeting my eyes. "Look where that got you." He suggested a gym membership, as if grief were weight you could lift until it left. He told me the kids needed structure, and I heard the subtext. They needed someone else. He drove away in the Mercedes that roared like it had something to prove, and I stood in the doorway listening to the exhaust settle like a sentence I hadn't agreed to serve. On the Friday before the children would speak, I found Hazel's ribbon on the kitchen table, curled like a question mark. I tied it in her hair before school. "For courage," I said. "For truth," she corrected, solemn as a judge. When I packed her lunch, I slipped in a note, "You are my sunshine," because some days a mother writes to her child and also to herself. That night, I lay awake and listened to headlights wash the ceiling. I thought about Dorothy's hands on my shoulders at 14, her voice saying, "Truth finds light, even if it has to crawl." I thought about Roland at the filing cabinet, the sealed folder he hid under a stack, the Florida brochure with numbers in the margin, the laugh on his phone that didn't belong to me. The next afternoon, when the bus sighed to a stop, Hazel jumped down with her ribbon askew and pressed a drawing into my hands, our house under a sun as big as a promise. She had drawn Roland closer again, his stick figure hand touching mine. Children edit hope the way adults edit memory. I taped the drawing to the fridge and told myself I would not let a courtroom teach her that love is a contest someone wins by lying. At the pre-hearing recess, Roland leaned close enough to say, "You can still make this easy." The way a salesman offers a discount while measuring your fear. I looked at his perfect tie, the cuticle he'd worried raw, the flicker of something like panic behind his eyes when he saw Janet approach. "The kids will be questioned in open court," he added, satisfied, as if logistics were destiny. I walked into the restroom and stared at my reflection until it stopped looking like an opponent. When I came back out, Hazel stood near the bench, tiny knees knocking, the purple ribbon trembling as if it, too, could feel the air change. She looked at me, then over my shoulder toward her father. I nodded once, permission small as a breath. She pinched the ribbon's ends like reins and drew in a careful inhalation that made the room seem loud. The bailiff called the court to order. The ticking clock faded into a new silence. Hazel climbed onto the small chair set for her, folded her hands in her lap, and the moment tilted, quiet as a hinge, away from the plan Roland had rehearsed. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper tired of being touched. Judge Patricia Thornwell's bench rose like a shoreline where storms were named, and I felt the pull of it in my ribcage as if the tide had found me. Roland sat 2 tables over with Victor Ashford, whose voice could turn concern into a tool. They leaned close, conferring, a portrait of poise. The bailiff called us to order, and the clock above the seal steadied its tick, as if time itself had agreed to be reasonable today. Janet's hand found mine for a second, a brief anchoring. "Remember your breath," she whispered. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. Breathing had become my only ritual that no one could cross-examine. I watched Roland straighten his cuff and thought of the brochure in his glove box, the margined figures, the laugh on his Bluetooth. Then I folded those thoughts like napkins. This part, Janet had explained, was theater. We would watch a performance and take notes in the dark. Ashford rose, and even the fluorescent lights seemed to approve. "Your Honor," he began with a nod that made the words sound like a partnership, "this case is about stability in the aftermath of tragedy. Mr. Greystone acknowledges the family's loss. He seeks only to provide structure, resources, and continuity. He gestured to a glossy binder that clicked open like a jaw. Exhibit A. The photo appeared on the monitors. Me at the grocery store, 2 weeks after the funeral, frozen in grainy defeat between a tower of paper towels and a pyramid of apples. My jaw clenched at the memory of finding a tin of my mother's favorite tea and realizing she'd never drink it again. Taken in public, with minor children present, Ashford explained, the phrase in public wearing a suit it hadn't earned. Mrs. Rowan's visible instability risked distressing the children. Janet approached the lectern when invited. Context matters, she said, voice even. A human moment of grief does not equal unfitness. She planted a small flag of sanity and returned, knowing flags can be ignored when the wind is paid. Next came Mrs. Hoffman from down the street, hair shellacked into one decision she'd made decades ago. She lifted her chin with the importance of being asked. I heard crying one afternoon, she said. For at least an hour, I was concerned. Concern dangled like a credential. Under cross, Janet coaxed the admission that Mrs. Hoffman couldn't be sure I was home. It might have been the sitter. Children cry. The hour became a while. Concern reverted to habit. Then Dennis Crawford, Roland's business partner, always genial at barbecues, fond of phrases like optics and positioning. He testified that at the company Christmas party I'd been disconnected, that the children had seemed to gravitate toward their father. He did not mention, and wasn't asked, that 3 days prior Dorothy's oncologist had said the quiet part out loud, there would be no spring. Janet pressed on the timeline. Dennis shrugged apologetically at the calendar, as if dates were an impolite trap. A child psychologist followed, immaculate and remote, who had never met Hazel or Timmy, but had reviewed materials. Given the stressors, she opined, placement with the parent providing higher structure could mitigate maladaptive coping. Words that sounded like furniture being rearranged while a house burned. Every sentence stacked upon the last, until the shape it made was persuasive from the back of the room. I stared at the edges, where the glue showed. Roland sat very still, as if stillness could read as virtue. When he glanced toward the gallery, a muscle in his jaw betrayed the discipline of his face. He was performing obligation for the court. I could almost feel him balancing his checkbook of impressions. Janet stood to cross the psychologist and did what she could with the absence. You've never observed the home, she said. Never interviewed the children. You reviewed a curated packet assembled by opposing counsel. The psychologist admitted these truths in syllables too small to rearrange the furniture. Do you believe sadness and parental unfitness are synonyms? Janet asked finally. The woman paused. No, she said, not inherently. A sentence that felt like a lamp turned on in daylight, useful but overshadowed. At one point, Ashford mentioned full disclosure of assets with a cadence that made the words anodyne. I watched Judge Thornwell's pen pause for a fraction of a second and almost nod to an almost question. The pen resumed. On another day, in a different case, that pen might have written a different story. Today, it underlined stability again. When it was my turn, Janet kept it spare. She asked about bedtime stories, about the lunchbox notes I slipped beside their sandwiches, about Hazel's ribbon and the way Timmy counted dinosaurs when the night pressed too close. I described how grief had not emptied me of competence, only made me careful about which hour could hold which task. My voice trembled twice. I let it, because control and truth aren't the same thing. Ashford's face softened in a way that read as respect and felt like theater. No further questions, he said, which is a kindness that hides its own blade. During a recess, the judge looked down at us over her glasses. Mrs. Rowan, she said not unkindly, the law must weigh patterns, not moments. Children need routines that do not buckle. The word buckle snuck into my chest and pressed its thumb against a part of me that had tried so hard not to. I nodded. There is a kind of humility that isn't surrender. I tried to wear that. We reconvened to decide whether the children would speak in chambers or in open court. Ashford stood. Transparency, Your Honor. My client believes the children would be best served by honesty in an environment that models it. He could make a surveillance camera sound like a nightlight. Janet requested chambers gently, citing the children's ages. The judge thought for a measured beat and compromised with kindness. Small chairs brought near the bench, A lowered microphone, a voice like a shield. Timothy went first. He tugged at his tiny tie as if it were a promise too tight. The bailiff helped him onto the child's chair, and the microphone found his voice where it hid. "Hi, Timothy," Judge Thornwell said. "We're just talking. There are no wrong answers?" He nodded, eyes flicking from her to Roland to me, like a moth testing lamps. "How are things at home?" He swallowed. Dad says Mom needs help." The room didn't breathe. "He says we should live with him so Mom can get better." He said it the way a child recites capitals he doesn't yet connect to maps. The syllables of "should live with him" came out crisp with practice. "What do you think?" the judge asked, gentle as before. "Not what Dad says, what Timothy thinks." He twisted his hands. "Sometimes Mom cries," he whispered. He looked at me then, and I willed my face to be a harbor, not a verdict. "Thank you," the judge said. "You did very well." He nodded, relief spilling out of his shoulders. When he passed Roland, a hand rose to touch his shoulder. Timothy flinched almost imperceptibly, then leaned into the contact because children are always negotiating between fear and belonging. As Timothy returned to the gallery, I felt that familiar heat rise, the one that wants to stand and shout through glass. Janet's fingers pressed my sleeve. Not yet. Across the aisle, Roland watched me watch our son, and for a breath long enough to sting, I saw the man who had once slept on a hospital chair when Hazel had an ear infection, counting her breaths until dawn. Then his mouth shaped words at Hazel, silent, precise, and the memory collapsed into choreography. "Hazel," the judge said, smiling as the bailiff guided her forward. The purple ribbon trembled like a live thing. Hazel climbed onto the chair, legs dangling, shoes knocking once against the rung. She folded her hands with the seriousness of fairy tales. The judge kept her voice low. "Sweetheart, can you tell me about living with Mommy and Daddy?" Hazel's eyes went to Roland first, as if he were a cue card. His lips formed something small and rehearsed. His brows lifted in the tiniest command. Then she looked at me. I touched 2 fingers to my heart and placed them on the table, our sign for "I'm here." She nodded, a private line connecting 2 chairs in a room of strangers. "Daddy said," she began, and the ribbon shivered. "Daddy said to tell you Mommy cries too much and forgets lunch sometimes." A murmur skated the back of the room. Roland settled an inch deeper in his chair, the satisfied motion of a chess player who believes he's glimpsed checkmate. Hazel blinked, and the room leaned closer. In the front row, Timothy gripped the edge of his seat as if he knew the next page could write him differently. Hazel took a breath that seemed to find the floor of her small body and push up through it. "But Mommy doesn't forget," she said, voice clearer. "She makes hearts and star sandwiches and writes notes. Yesterday my note said, 'You are my sunshine.'" The court reporter's fingers paused mid-flight, then resumed, recording an alchemy no transcript could hold. Roland's jaw flexed. His lips moved again. "Remember." Hazel looked back to the judge, then to me, then down at the ribbon, which she pinched like reins. The judge's face softened, but her posture stayed formal. She glanced at Ashford in a way that said the road was about to curve. Hazel leaned a fraction closer to the microphone so it could carry what she'd decided to do. "Your Honor," she said, the title careful in her mouth, "there's something I need to tell you." The clock above us ticked, and then didn't. My heartbeat nested in the absence. Hazel's fingers smoothed the ribbon once, twice, and she lifted her chin a degree that felt like sunrise. The air inside the courtroom thickened, like everyone had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. Hazel's voice came small at first, the tremor of a 6-year-old deciding to lift something heavy. "Daddy told us to lie," she said, every syllable clicking into the microphone like a secret she was finally allowed to set down. "He made us practice in his office. He said if we didn't help him win, we'd never see Mommy again." Judge Thornwell's brows lifted, but her tone stayed even. "You're doing fine, sweetheart. You can keep going." Hazel nodded and gripped the edge of the chair. "Daddy said Mommy was sick in the head because Grandma died, but that's not true. Mommy is sad, but she still takes care of us. She reads us stories every night and makes hot chocolate with extra marshmallows when we have bad dreams." Roland shifted in his seat, color rising up his neck. "That's enough," he muttered. The judge's gaze snapped toward him. "Mr. Rowan, you will remain silent." Hazel looked back at the bench, courage flickering and then strengthening. "There's more," she whispered. He said if he got us, he could use the money Grandma left for us. He said it was in a trust fund. He told his friend Veronica on the phone that it was almost $2 million. The words fell into the room and shattered whatever was left of Roland's composure. He shot up, chair scraping across the tile. Shut up! She doesn't know what she's talking about. The gavel cracked once, sharp and final. Bailiff. 2 uniforms closed in, hands firm on Roland's shoulders. His breathing came loud and animal. Mr. Rowan, the judge said, each word a nail, you will sit down or be held in contempt. He froze, jaw flexing, then dropped back into his chair. The noise of him sitting echoed like thunder that couldn't quite leave the valley. Hazel's lip quivered, but she kept her eyes on the judge. 3 weeks ago, Daddy was talking on the phone in his office. He didn't know I was playing behind the couch with my dolls. He was talking to Veronica. That's his girlfriend. She said it the way a child says a new vocabulary word, careful and exact. I saw them kissing once when he took us to his office on Saturday. He told her that Grandma left money for me and Timmy, and that if he got custody, he could use it until we're 18. A gasp moved through the courtroom like wind through grass. Janet's fingers tightened on my hand under the table. Roland's lawyer, Ashford, started rifling papers, whispering frantically. Did he say how much money, Hazel? The judge asked softly. She nodded. He said $2 million. He said he owed people a lot and couldn't get more loans. He said once he got the kids, he could use our money to save his company and buy the beach house in Florida for Veronica. Timothy stood up in the gallery before anyone could stop him. I heard it too, his voice cracked. He was in the car on speakerphone. I was in the back seat. He forgot I was there. The judge gestured to the bailiff. Bring him up, please. Timothy climbed into the chair beside his sister, the microphone wobbling as it adjusted to his height. Dad told us to lie, he said, fists balled tight on his knees. He said Mommy was crazy, but she's not. She just misses Grandma. She helps us with homework. She makes dinner every night, not just pizza. Dad's the one who's never home, and when he is, he just yells for us to be quiet. Hazel nodded vigorously beside him. He said Mommy was stupid and that judges believe dads in nice suits. He laughed about it. He said once he got the money, he'd divorce Mommy and throw her out like trash. Judge Thornwell leaned forward, pen tapping once against the bench. Mr. Rowan, is there a trust established by Dorothy Rowan for these children? Ashford half rose. Your Honor, I'm not asking you, Counselor. Roland's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The room waited. Yes, he said finally, the words scraping out of him. The judge's pen stilled. And you concealed this from the court? He stared at the floor. Yes. The gavel cracked again. You attempted to defraud your own children, she said, voice cutting cleanly through the hush. You coached minors to lie under oath and manipulated these proceedings for financial gain. She turned to Janet. Counselor Riverside, I'm granting your client immediate full custody, sole legal and physical rights. Mr. Rowan will have supervised visitation only, pending investigation by Child Protective Services and the District Attorney for fraud, coercion of minors, and perjury. Ashford rose, pale now, voice stripped of confidence. Your Honor, we intend to appeal. The judge's eyes narrowed. Your client is fortunate he's not leaving here in handcuffs. She looked back to me. Mrs. Rowan, you will remain trustee of the children's inheritance. The trust will stay intact for their education and future. Mr. Rowan will pay child support of $3,000 per month and may not enter the family home except during approved visits. The gavel struck a final time. Court adjourned. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Hazel turned, climbing down carefully from the chair. She came straight to me, ribbon half slipped from her braid. I knelt and pulled both of them close. The world outside the courthouse felt suddenly too bright. The October sun, sharp as forgiveness, I hadn't yet found words for. Mommy, Hazel said into my shoulder. I'm sorry Daddy was mean. I pulled back just enough to see her face. You were brave, I told her. Grandma would be so proud. She told me to tell the truth, Hazel said. In my dream last night, she said the truth always wins, even when liars wear fancy suits. I believed her. For the first time in months, I let my lungs fill all the way to the bottom. The ribbon slipped from her hair, landing between us on the courthouse steps. I picked it up and tied it back gently. Then let's go home, sunshine, I whispered. We've got stories to read. Behind us, Roland sat at the defense table, wrists resting limp against polished wood, his empire of lies collapsing in silence. The bailiff whispered something I couldn't hear, and the sound of Hazel's small laughter carried down the hall like a verdict that didn't need a gavel. 3 months later, the sound of mourning in our house changed. It no longer started with silence heavy enough to wake me, or the echo of an absent engine idling down the street. It began instead with Hazel humming in the kitchen, buttering toast, and Timmy arguing with the dog about who deserved the last piece of bacon. The library had taken me back full time. Between shelving returns and reading to the children's hour crowd, I'd learned to trust the clock again. I could breathe in minutes instead of waiting for the next crisis. Sometimes, though, in the late afternoon, when the sunlight fell through the tall windows just so, I caught the smell of Dorothy's perfume in the dust. A gentle reminder that grief doesn't vanish, it just sits quieter. The court's investigation came and went, like weather we'd been warned about. The district attorney's report confirmed what Hazel and Timmy had already made clear. Roland's real estate firm was $800,000 in debt, its glossy success a set piece held together by loans he'd never repay. He'd used investor money to fund his suits, his car, and the office where he'd made my children rehearse their lies. The Mercedes was repossessed within a month of the verdict. The beach house in Florida had never been more than a brochure dream. Veronica, the secretary-turned-girlfriend, quit the day after the story broke, leaving behind a desk drawer full of unopened bills and one half-empty bottle of perfume that smelled too much like deceit. Roland now worked at a car dealership on the west side of town. The court garnished his wages for child support, $3,000 a month, wired automatically into an account I never touch except for the kids' needs. Supervised visitation took place one weekend a month at the family center downtown. The first time, Hazel refused to go. The second time, she brought a drawing for him, a picture of a house with no doors. "It's safe that way," she'd told the caseworker. The third visit, Timmy went alone and came home quieter than usual. I didn't ask for details. Some truths need to ripen before they're told. The trust fund turned out to be larger than any of us imagined, $2.3 million, a nest my mother had built from my father's life insurance and her own careful saving. She'd hidden her planning behind modest living, her last gift, the ability to protect her grandchildren from everything money usually breaks. I became the sole trustee, with the help of a patient accountant who wore sweaters that smelled faintly of peppermint. "Your mother was wise," he told me. She believed in steady growth and long horizons. I smiled because that sounded like her. Some evenings, after the children were asleep, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and think about Roland's face when the truth finally settled in. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, just the ache of watching someone I once loved dismantle himself piece by piece. I didn't wish him ruin. I only wanted the noise of him, the constant calculation, to fade enough for the kids to remember his laugh before greed rewired it. Hazel's purple ribbon now lived in a small glass shadow box beside Dorothy's photograph on the hallway shelf. Underneath, we'd placed the note she'd read in court, "You are my sunshine," creased and faint from being folded too many times. It had become our house emblem, a private flag for survival. The day we packed up the last of the court documents, Hazel stood in the doorway, holding the file box. "Is it over now?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "at least the loud part." She nodded, setting the box down gently. "Then, can we make cookies?" We did. Chocolate chip, the way Grandma liked them. When I pulled the tray from the oven, Hazel grinned. "Judges would like these," she said solemnly. "I'm going to be one when I grow up, so I can listen to kids." Timmy looked up from his homework. "I'll be a teacher," he said, "so kids don't have to be scared of grown-ups." The lump in my throat was made of equal parts pride and ache. "Good," I said. "The world could use more of both." Later that night, after I tucked them in, I opened the mail stacked on the kitchen counter. Among the bills and coupons sat a thick envelope from an out-of-state accountant. Inside was a letter, explaining a small, previously undisclosed portfolio my mother had set aside years ago. Nothing like the trust, but enough to start college funds in their own names. At the bottom, in my mother's looping handwriting, she'd written, "For their first step into the world, may it always be honest." I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounds like breathing. "You planned everything, didn't you, Mom?" I whispered. When the next visitation weekend arrived, Hazel wore her ribbon again. "Maybe Daddy's learning," she said. Not entirely hopeful, but not entirely doubtful either. Afterward, the caseworker reported that Roland had apologized to them. awkwardly, haltingly, like a man translating his remorse through a language he'd only just begun to learn. I didn't know if it mattered yet, but it was a start. In December, a letter arrived, addressed to me in Roland's careful handwriting. No return address, just my name. Inside, a single line. I'm trying to become someone they can remember without hating. There was no signature, but the handwriting was enough. I placed it in a folder labeled "For Later," because forgiveness, like healing, has its own calendar. At the library's winter gala, Janet Riverside stopped by the table where I was helping with the raffle tickets. She looked rested, lighter. "You made quite an impression on Judge Thornwell," she said. "Word is they're reviewing some of the custody protocols after your case. Maybe fewer performances, more protection." She smiled faintly. "That's progress." I thanked her, meaning it. She'd fought a giant with a paper shield and still won. When she left, I watched the snow start to drift outside the windows, each flake quiet and insistent, proof that change doesn't have to be loud. Back home, the kids had fallen asleep on the couch under a blanket of storybooks. I covered them, turned off the lamp, and stood there for a while, listening to the hum of the heater and the steady, unhurried rhythm of peace reclaiming a house. Dorothy once told me that truth finds its light eventually, even if it has to crawl through the dark to do it. Watching Hazel's ribbon sway slightly in the hallway air, I understood what she meant. The truth had crawled, but it had made it home.